بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله وكفى وسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى أما بعد رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, dear respected brothers, elders, fellow community members. So it's been quite a long hiatus, a bit of a break. We've had 2 months since we had the first session. So this is actually, just to jog your memories, this is session number 3 of the Resistance series, but part 2 of session 3, just because we had so much to cover. I thought I'd rather deliver it in piecemeal so we're not overwhelmed. So can anybody just, maybe I'll throw out a few questions here as trivia so we can jog our memories from the first session, which was 30th of December actually, so quite a while away. Okay, so we talked about Umar al-Mukhtar, that was the first session. Session number 2, we then talked about Fakhri Pasha. And what's the nationality of focus today? I've not actually introduced the hero, but I've just touched on the nationality, just so maybe if you have an idea, then you can think about it in your head. We're talking about Algeria. And does anybody know the Arabic word for North Africa? We did mention it last session. We had quite a list. Al-Maghrib, Al-Maghrib. And who are the indigenous locals in Al-Maghrib, even before Islam, in pre-Islamic times? The Berber people, the Berber people. So they were very central to our first, maybe even, we talked about nearly 8-9 centuries of North African history. And it was quite rich and complex and multifaceted as well. But we ended in which year? Which year did we stop at? So we talked about Muslim history and expansion in North Africa from Umar radiallahu anhu's time in Egypt under his governor, Amr ibn al-As radiallahu anhu, all the way up until a specific year, because something happened in that year. The year was 1830. So we stopped in the year 1830 just because a foreign European power had their ambition set in North Africa, more specifically in Algeria. And this is where our hero can now take his mantle and earn his rightful place in Islamic history. So you've got the slides on the screen there. So Al-Maghrib is the west, meaning from an eastern point of view. Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, we had Ifriqiya, which was the modern region of Tunisia, Jazair, which is Algeria, and then the Berbers. But like we said, the politically correct term to use isn't Berbers, it's Amazigh. It's Amazigh. That's what they like to refer to themselves as. And then you had all of these different maps charting Muslim expansion and territorial gain as well. And we ended here. So this is what the Ottoman Empire looked like in 1683. And Algeria was actually captured for the Ottomans in the year 1517. And then it was transformed into what's known as the Regency of Algiers, meaning you had a few government officials from Istanbul who were sent periodically. It was what was known as a triennial bashwa, which means every 3 years you had a pasha, who was a high-ranking senior official from Istanbul sent to govern Algeria. And then over the 16th century, over the 1500s, the Ottomans then conquered Tunisia and Libya, but Morocco managed to hold out. So at that time, the sovereign states in Morocco itself were known as the Saadis. And when it came to the 1600s, they were replaced by the Alawites. The Alawites are still in control today. So the Sultan of Morocco is actually part of this long dynasty of Alawite rulers. So this is what the Ottoman Empire looked at. And you can see that in the encircled area, you've got Algiers, Tripoli, and then Tunis. So Algiers was the center of Ottoman activity in North Africa. And if you can jog your memories, in European Christian terms, and even in America, this area was known as the Barbary Coast, just because they thought that this entire strip of Mediterranean coastland was inhabited by barbarians and pirates. And if you can remember, we talked about the origins behind Captain Jack Sparrow, who was actually a mutineer, a privateer from England, who made his way all the way to Tunis, and he made a living and fortune for himself. He ended up accepting Islam as well. Okay, so now we move into 1830, the events of 1830. And this is the French invasion. Now, you can find these facts anywhere, even in French records, just open information, freedom of information inquest if you want to make one. You can find these records, you can find data everywhere. But what I want to highlight today is not the French invasion itself, rather the philosophy which spurred on the French invasion. Because invasions and conquests and military campaigns happen all the time, right? But what's important to analyze is, why did they happen? And for what purpose were they conducted? So when you look at Muslim expansion across history, especially in the first 100 years, what propelled Muslims from a small mini-state in Medina all the way to Spain in the west and to the borders of China in the east and Sindh and Pakistan in the east within 100 years? This happened within 100 years. Whilst the epigons, the tabi'un, the people who saw the companions during their era, and they were the commanders of these armies as well. So what took the Muslims from Medina to the east and the west? It was one simple idea, one simple philosophy, which was we want to spread the justice of Islam. And where does the justice of Islam come from? It comes from the Quran. So there's actually something one historian calls the golden chain of events. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent down the Quran. And the Quran brought about its own brand and version and franchise of justice, which is different, it's unique in its conceptualization and in its idea of justice, as compared to all of the other civilizations that have come in the past and that we're witnessing today. Now, if people act upon and implement this idea of Quranic justice, then justice normally begets and justice normally brings about peace. And in times of peace, people can focus on developing and upgrading their own civilization. And peace leads to prosperity. That's what led to the Muslims at their peak, at their zenith, ruling over huge swathes of land. Nearly 11 million kilometers squared of land, territory was owned by the Umayyads. So if you think about this, people today want to return back to the glory days and the heydays of Islam. Well, that formula is there right in front of you. And it all goes back to the Quran. The Quran had its justice. Justice brings peace. Peace brings prosperity. And look at what's dubbed as the golden age of Muslim civilization, where concepts that we take for granted in school textbooks like algebra and arithmetic were actually developed and, in a way, invented by Muslims. Muslims were at the height of civilizational development. At that time, the Europeans were experiencing an era in their history known as the Dark Ages. And that's why European historians really gloss over the entire world during the Dark Ages, because of their Eurocentric vision, which is the world is Europe and Europe is the world. So if nothing's happening in Europe, nothing's happening in the world. But look across the Mediterranean, and Muslim cities, Muslim population, Muslim civilizations were skyrocketing, far ahead of the Europeans. In the 9th century, Cordoba was one of the leading cities in the world. And it had a population of 500,000 people. At the same time in London, London was one of the largest cities in Europe. They had 20,000 people. And if you wanted to remove your waste, your excreta in Europe, then you just throw it out the window in a bucket. But in Cordoba, in Cordoba, in Spain, the local government, the municipality actually had donkeys going around street to street collecting rubbish. So they had dustbin men, they had infrastructure set up, they had local institutions. So they were light years ahead of the West. So when we talk about the French invasion, there's a reason why they invaded. There are a few different reasons, but one of them which I really want to focus on today is, we'll leave that for a second, is this here, which is liberalism. This was their driving force. This was the idea which propelled, by and large, it propelled and justified not just the French invasion, but nearly 2 centuries worth of colonialism and genocide. So if you want to pinpoint where colonialism actually started, then you could, to an extent, pinpoint it to this incident here, to the 1830 revolution to the 1830 invasion of Algeria. But I just want to go back to a second to this. Let's leave it on this slide for a second. So if we really pry open this era of history, then we'll see how it exposes the dark psyche and how these men really operated in France, and how their stance of the moral high ground led them to commit the unthinkable. Because people in the West always lambast and criticize the Muslims for jihad and the institution of jihad. But by the end of this session, I want to introduce you to what's known as liberal jihad, a term that I've coined as well, European jihad, because it exists in the West as well. But because all the focus and all the limelight is directed towards the Muslims, then it's a distraction tactic to divert your attention away from what the West have done and what they are still capable of doing as well. So this is the true nature of Western liberalism. And the French epitomize this in Algeria. And the thing is, this still shapes Western thought till today. And I'll give you a few examples. One of them is, from a few months ago, there was a chief foreign representative in the EU, and he gave a speech for about 2 minutes. And he said, the West, or Europe in general, Europe in specific, is a garden, and the rest of the world is a jungle. So it's a responsibility. He said this live on camera. It's there for you to see on YouTube. He said, the people in the West, the people in Europe, who are the inhabitants of this garden, are civilized, are sophisticated, are rational. And it's their duty to spread this civilizational message to the rest of the people in the jungle. So just look at the wording he uses. Who inhabits the jungle? Wild animals. So with just one term, he's classed the entire world, bar Europe, as a jungle filled with barbaric animals, backwards, antiquated, outmoded animals. And it's Europe's mission to enlighten the rest of the world. This isn't last year or 2 years ago or from 1830 from France. This is just a few months ago. So you can see how this sentiment still persists in the highest echelons of Western government as well. And this is from the EU. So what I want to quickly do is, before we get to this, I want to define liberalism, because this is what's propelled the Western world for the last 300 years. So it comes from the Latin word liber, which means to be free or independent, which means I want to do what I want to do. I want my freedom, I want my liberty, I want my rights. Now, different people will define it with different things. The best term to define liberalism with is something called the harm principle. And the reason why I'm focusing on this is because the dominant ethic in the world, when I mean ethic, I mean what decides what's good and what's bad. The dominant morality in the world is liberalism. Why do we have the onslaught of feminism and maybe the LGBTQ movement and atheism? It all leads back to liberalism. So the harm principle is very simple. And you can see how all of the attacks launched on traditional Muslim ideas today, all the counter-arguments stem from the harm principle. And I'll just explain it in very simple terms, which is people should be let free. People should be allowed to do what they want to do, what they feel like doing, so long as it doesn't harm somebody else. So when people try to justify homosexuality, they'll say, well, if it's between two consenting, either males or females, then what's your business? Let them do what they want to do. So that's the idea here. Well, I mean, let a woman wear what she wants to wear. As long as she's not harming anybody else, then she should be free to do what she wants to do. That's what you call the harm principle. And this was theorized by somebody called John Stuart Mill in the 1700s. He was a liberal theorist. So the problem with this is, if you can think about it, what's the main problem with this? Well, who defines what harm is? The harm principle, right? So you might say a woman walking out on the street, unclad, without any clothes on, maybe scantily dressed. Where's the harm in that? Us as Muslims, when it comes to the issue of morality, well, who decides what's good and bad? Then it's simple, it's clear cut. There's no need to get into any philosophical debate. It's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Prophet. Allah says in the Quran, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Prophet, when they both have decreed a matter, then it doesn't behove a Muslim to have his own opinion, to have his own say about what Allah has already decreed, what Allah has already legislated, what Allah has already stamped down. So what's classed as harmful and what's classed as beneficial, well, that's down to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's how we combat this idea of the harm principle. So anyway, let's just rewind a little bit. So this is the picture here on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side. The man with the turban is somebody called Hussein Dey. And the man on the right is the French consul, Pierre Deval. The reason why I'm talking about this is because how did the French, now you can't just march into uncharted, unknown territory and foreign territory. You have to conjure up a few motives and factors. So in 1827, this happened in 1827, Hussein Dey, he was the regional governor, Ottoman governor in Algiers. Algiers was the capital of the regency of Algiers. And he'd called the French consul Pierre Deval to have a private audience with himself. Why? Because when Napoleon, the famous, ironically, Italian general of France, and later the Emperor Napoleon, when he was carrying out his Napoleonic campaign, you need food to feed your troops. Now, you need money to then buy that food. So in Algeria, in Algiers more specifically, you had very rich and affluent Jewish families. And they were farmers, and they controlled the wheat trade in Algiers itself. So the French government approached the Jews, and the Jews said, look, we'll be the brokers between you and the government in Algiers. So we'll obtain the wheat from the government, and then we'll sell it to you at either cost price or a little bit of a higher price for them to make their profit. Now the thing is, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, a few decades went on, and the French hadn't repaid the Ottoman Day in Algiers for the wheat that they'd been buying. And I'm not talking about just a few shipments of wheat. I'm talking about wheat enough to sustain an entire army on multiple campaigns. So they'd amassed an arrears of nearly 8 million francs, so 8 million gold coins. So he was furious, Hussein Dey. He wanted his money back. So he called Pierre de Val. And they had a heated exchange of words. And in a fit of impulse and rage, with his little fly swatter, he struck Pierre de Val. He struck the French consul. And ironically, that then spurred events over the next 3 years, which led to the French invasion. Just because one man hit another man. So the French were infuriated, and this was seen as something dishonorable. This was seen as an attack on their honor and on their nobility. So they wanted to take vengeance for that. Now this is what's normally written in the books of history, which is fair enough because you always need what's called a casus belli. You always need a reason for war. So this is one of the reasons for war. There were also a few things happening in France at the same time. The French government were going through a bit of turmoil. So what better way to unify your own ranks than to direct national interests and national efforts abroad and to a foreign threat? So we've seen that today. There's no need to go into examples. How let's create an other. Let's create a whole foreign element for us to unite all of our ranks. Let's create the immigrant so that different elements within our own country who don't see eye to eye can now stand on the same pedestal and share the same wavelength. So this is a perennial tactic which is used by governments all across history. So this was just a distraction as a military expedition. And back home in France, turmoil was erupting. So the government didn't feel safe. So why don't we send all the peasantry and all the unruly soldiers abroad? So that can create some peace and stability within our own lands. And also this would, now I mean, if we can then capture foreign territory, then this would ensure in the upcoming elections, surprise, surprise, that the royal party would be successful. So anyway, they launched their offensive, and these are the territories that they captured. The French were in Algeria for nearly 130 years, from 1830 all the way up until 1962. So some people here might have been alive when the French were finally ousted. Our grandfathers definitely witnessed. Our grandfathers, just sit down with them and they're like an open book of history. They lived through all of these events. So in 1962, they were finally kicked out. Now the thing is, this wasn't just your average military expedition, a military conquest. And people must have heard this often repeated quote, phrase, which is, Islam was spread by the sword. But that couldn't be further from the truth. That couldn't be further from the truth. You look at all of the Muslim expansion efforts in the first 100 years of Islam, and you will see that every single 99% of them were characterized by a peaceful conquest, a peaceful takeover, and a liberation. They were seen as liberators. Even the indigenous people saw them as liberators. When the Muslims, we're talking about the companions here, entered into Damascus during the reign of Umar radiallahu anh, then the local Christians welcomed them with open arms because the Byzantines were oppressive, they were levying harsh taxes, and the people just couldn't take the oppression and the burden. So they welcomed the Muslims with open arms. Not only that, the Muslims levy something called the jizya, which is the poll tax. So if you're non-Muslim, then you pay a tax to secure your rights and your citizenship in the Muslim state. So the Muslims took the poll tax from the citizens of Damascus. And they'd learned that a Byzantine army was amassing on the border to fight the Muslims. So the Muslims said, we don't want to endanger the majority Christian citizens in Damascus, so we're going to pack our bags, mobilize our army, and head out to meet the Byzantines face to face in an open field, pitched battle formation combat. So before they left, you know what they did? They went back to the citizens and they said, here's your poll tax, you can take it back. So the citizens were absolutely astonished. They were taken aback. You've taken taxes from us and now you're giving them back to us. The Byzantines would never do that. The Byzantines, if they were in this situation, they'd take more taxes, saying we need it for our defense budget, we're about to carry out a war. The Muslims said, no, we entered into a contract with you, and our Prophet and our religion instructs us, commands us to uphold our pledges and promises with people. This money was taken in return for protection from ourselves. Now that we can't protect you because we're mobilizing and marching out to face the enemy, we can give you this money back. And the Christian subject said, we're waiting right here. As soon as you defeat the Byzantine army, you can come back, we'll give you our money. We'll give you our taxes. Now you bring me one instance in history where the citizens are willing to give their taxes to the so-called conquering invading forces. So this French invasion was characterized by anything but peaceful measures. There were two bouts of brutality and deadly suppression. We're talking about, if you want to talk about terrorism, here is an example of terrorism. If you want to talk about genocide, here are examples of genocide. If you want to talk about pogroms, here are examples of pogroms and violence and conflict and hostility. You had two initial bouts. Number one was the initial conquest from 1830 to 1875. It took the French 20 years to finally consolidate and bring Algeria under their reign. And by 1956, this is the entirety of Algeria under French control. And then you had the Algerian War of Independence from 1954 to 1962. So we're only going to focus on the first bout of oppression here, which is from 1830 to 1875. Altogether, for 130 years, whilst the French were there, they inflicted, the casualty rates differ here, but from a range of 5 to 10 million people. 5 to 10 million people were killed. These are our Muslim brothers and sisters, Algerian nationals. When the French came, the population was around 3 to 4 million. And when they ended this first period of hostility, they had directly or indirectly killed almost 1.6 million people. So by the time the French were finished with their dirty deals, then almost 1/3 of the population had been wiped out. 800,000 through direct warfare, and then another 800,000 due to famine. And this is a stage, an artificial economic collapse. And we'll talk about the brutish tactics later on. Now the thing is, the French weren't alone in this. The British had similar policies, and the Dutch, and the Americans, and the Italians. So this isn't just a one-off. The French set the scene here. Like we talked about Umar al-Mukhtar, if you can remember, General Graziani, and he carried out all-out warfare, not against an enemy army, but against civilians. But the French were the ones who provided a model and a template for further colonizers to then spread their colonial efforts around the world. So it took the French 20 years to completely conquer Algeria, and then another 20 years for them to replace the army with now a civilian administration. And when the Algerians started to flood into Algeria, when the settlers and the colons, as they're called, started to flood into Algeria, their mission was to transform Algeria into a miniature version of France, into a metropolitan France. And they managed to do that. And when they did do that, then they invited all sorts of European settlers and all sorts of European expatriates to move in with them. So then you had French citizens and Italian citizens, Spanish citizens, who were all brought into Algeria. So 1/6 of the population, by the time you got to 1900s, by the year 1900, 1/6 of the population was made up of Europeans. And they settled in cities like Oran and Algiers. Now they wanted to develop their colonies economically, but more so, this is where we move into now their sinister and insidious ambitions, which is they wanted to grow the colonized in terms of their moral standards. So they saw the local Algerians as people who were bereft of any morals, people bereft of any civilizational identity, people who had no respect, people who had no dignity, people who had no brain. They were classed as subhumans. So they wanted to carry out a complete restructure of society to make them more humane and to make them more, quote unquote, civilized and free. This is what's known as the civilizing mission. And that's why some historians have dubbed the whole period of colonization as, quite crudely and candidly, as the white man's mission, which is, it's our job, it's our duty, it's our responsibility to spread our enlightened way of life across the world. And if you can see today, liberalism dominates the world, whether it's through cultural influence or whether it's through government imposition. And this is the stark, harsh, true reality, which is in the West, and maybe even in the world, we might be functionally Muslims, but fundamentally you have to ask yourselves, are we fundamentally Muslim? Or are we fundamentally liberal? Just look at the protest which took place in Iran a few months ago, where they were burning their headscarves. That was a symbol of their defiance against the state. But unwittingly, in their defiance against the state, they were defying Allah. and his laws and his rules. This is an example of where you're fundamentally liberal. They might have been wearing their headscarf, but you want to ask them, why are you wearing your headscarf? This is really important. These are a few litmus tests that you can use. For example, some Muslims will say, I wear the headscarf, I wear the hijab, because it's my choice. Because I feel like the headscarf empowers me. I feel like the headscarf is an opportunity for me to bring about my own identity and for me to show the world who I really am. That is indicative of a liberal fundamental underpinning. Why? Because you don't pray salah because it makes you feel good. You pray salah because Allah's told you to pray your salah. That's what you call fundamentally Muslim. You listen to your parents not because you want something from them, but because Allah has told you to do so. Fundamentally Muslim. You wear a headscarf because Allah has told you to do so. That's what you call fundamentally Muslim. So this is an example of people in the West where you're functionally Muslim but fundamentally liberal or fundamentally something else. So that's why this liberal world hegemony is very, very dangerous to Muslims as well, because it's quite clandestine and it works under the guise of freedom of choice. It works under the guise of liberty. It works under the guise of express yourself and find who you truly are, your own destiny, your own voyage and your own journey. Whereas as Muslims, it's very simple. How do we rationalize our positions? Because Allah has told us to do so. That's what you call fundamentally Muslim. ما كان لمؤمن ولا مؤمنة إذا قضى أمرا sorry. ما كان لمؤمن ولا مؤمنة إذا قضى الله ورسوله أمرا أن يكون لهم الخيرة من أمرهم. I need to brush up on my door. I know Ramzan's coming up as well. Which is, like we just said just a few moments ago, if Allah has decreed something, you have no say in it. You have no say in it. You have to submit yourself to the will and decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's what a Muslim is. A Muslim is somebody who is submissive, not to the world or not to the liberal world order, but to his master, who is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So anyway, this is what you call the white man's mission, which is colonialism. And France strongly believed in this. And they found now that our ideals of spreading human rights and spreading our liberal ideas now conflicts with human dignity, and it contradicts now the religion and the culture of the people we want to colonize. So that's a big problem. And they combated this with one philosophy, which is the ends justify the means. So because we want to spread our enlightened ideas, it doesn't matter whether they want it or not. I mean, have you even asked the colonized people whether they want to be the subjects and victims of this experiment, of the civilizing mission? Do they need civilizing? This is one problem, which is who decides whose morals are better. And why should other people succumb to the liberal world order? And why should other people succumb to Western philosophers? And Western philosophers understood this. So they justified their force, like we said. They justified propagating their ideas with force, with the sword. Here we go. Like people say jihad and Islam was spread by the sword, while liberal ideas were spread by the sword. Ends justify the means. And in France, they saw an opportunity to enact their nefarious ends here in Algeria. Algeria, in their eyes, was a backwater wasteland. Nothing happening there. So it's in dire need of what we call our own civilizational progress. So they scoped out financial potential there. But really, for the theorists, it was all about spreading their enlightened ideas. So they used the Algerians. When they went there, they ended up using the Algerians as low status, as subhuman laborers for their own agricultural and real estate opportunities. And that's why then they started to choke the Algerians into submission. And Algeria now became the breadbasket for France, where the production of wheat and wine had now grown exponentially, and it was now being transported and exported back to France as well. These are two people here that I want to introduce you to. On the left, a French philosopher, a liberal theorist called Alexis de Tocqueville. On the right-hand side, you have, we're going to talk about our hero of the story in just a few minutes, but he is the anti-hero. He is the arch nemesis of our hero. General Beaujeu was his name. They're both French. And these people were these two, more specifically. Now, they represented the ruling class and the military classes in France, both of these two. They were infuriated Why? Because of how ferocious the resistance was from the Algerians and how ferocious their jihad was. They expected people to submit willingly and bow down to their civilizing mission. Little did they know the world didn't want their civilization. The world didn't want to be enlightened by their ideas. So, how do you pursue your goals? They ended up pursuing total war, exterminating the Algerians. And General Bugeaud, there are a few quotes of him we'll talk about later on, I'll bring up. But he gave his soldiers a blank check. We have to root out the resistance against France. So he gave his soldiers free permission to do whatever they wanted to. They were given the go-ahead to torture, to rape. They were notorious for mutilating bodies, decapitating heads as well. Just recently, just a few years ago, the French actually returned the skulls of 60 Algerian freedom fighters from the second bout of French oppression during the Algerian War of Independence. Just recently, they kept them as trophies in a French museum to show off their civilizational mission and their ambitions as well. They saw direct warfare, these two, as insufficient. It's not going to work. So they decided to cause an economic collapse so that they can secure the obedience of the Algerians. You had a quote here. This is what one of the French soldiers who worked under Bugeaud actually wrote in a French periodical. I'm going to read it out here. He said, "We have found the more efficient way than burning crops, which is waging an incessant war, which impacts the population through individuals and in all their interests. The flights, the continuous alarms, the enormous losses inflicted by the razzias." The razzia we'll talk about later on was their go-to device, which was in their toolkit of abominations, which was to carry out these quick, short raids into local Algerian villages, raiding, pillaging, raping, torturing, and then pulling themselves out straight away so that the resistance has no time to stage a counterattack. And even by mere relocations, the women and children we captured, the old, the women, the children, and the herds who perished from fatigue and hunger. The necessity to live the entire winter in the harshest mountains, on summits covered with snow, that is what, for better or worse, pushed the Arabs into submission. This is what they did to our fellow Muslim brothers and sisters in Algeria. You had another statement here. This is a statement of General Bugeaud. Now, I thought, why would I have to even explain all of these things? Well, you can hear it from the horse's mouth itself. He said, "I have often heard men in France who I respect, but whom I do not approve, find it wrong that we burn harvests, that we empty silos, and finally we seize unarmed men, women, and children." These are non-combatants, innocents. "These are, according to me, unfortunate necessities, but ones to which any people who want to make war on Arabs is obliged to submit." The idea of the ends justify the means. If we can get these people to submit to our ethics and our values through any means necessary, then it has to be given the go-ahead. It has to be justified. This is, again, what another general called General Montagnac, he said, "He who wants the end wants the means." Specifically what we're talking about. "In my opinion, all populations of Algeria who do not accept our conditions must be razed. Everything must be taken, ransacked, regardless of age and sex. The grass should no longer grow where the French army set foot." So why do I have to explain these things when they're telling you themselves? We had a few others. We'll get to this later on in a few minutes. You had Alexis de Tocqueville. So he was there in the parliament in France. And debates were going on. Now, we have to be honest with ourselves. There were a few elements in France who were against the harsh, brutal methods employed by General Bugeaud and General Montagnac. But the vast majority were in favor. And their ideas were epitomized by Alexis de Tocqueville. He was a member of parliament. And he was a very famous liberal philosopher. And he directed operations in Algeria. He was one of the foremost experts of this civilizational mission there. And he was an exponent, he was a champion of the ends justify the means. This is the idea. This is the idea of intellectual subjugation and intellectual colonialism, where the colonial servants and slaves are made to feel inferior. And we see that today, where people don't have the confidence and courage to be Muslims, where Muslims are facing an identity crisis. Why? Because of the liberal hegemony around the world. Muslims are made to feel ashamed of their own heritage. Muslims are made to feel ashamed that we worship Allah and we submit not to our desires or to our whims, but to a higher being and higher entity, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he championed all of these ideas. And there was one high-ranking French administrator in 1832, and again, just sums up what we're talking about here. He said, to pacify and enlighten these countries by turn, and extend again the benefits of science that have been lost for so many centuries, that is the noble mission which France has proposed for herself and which she will complete. So everybody was on board here. This was across the board. Everybody shared this same public sentiment. So we'll just skip forward to be here. But in 1846 now, the French decreed that land was to now be seized. Land was to now be confiscated. So you had nearly 200,000 hectares of land which was confiscated, and only 1/10 of that went to Algerians. So it was all then pumped into the French colonizing mission. Now this is where a very important bit of context to one of today's greatest controversies comes to play, which is jihad. So you hear about the outrage pouring from the West, and indeed from many Muslim quarters, that jihad has actually originated from Muslim lands. Jihad, the whole concept of jihad is Muslims invading Western lands. But the thing is, jihad initially was invoked to resist colonialism. So why is there such a stigma attached to jihad today? Because media outlets, even back then, we're talking about even during the French occupation, had to demonize jihad. Why? So that they can delegitimize the Algerian resistance. The Algerian resistance was built upon jihad, which is defending your own homeland, defending your own values. And if we can now undercut and delegitimize the Muslim call for jihad, then the resistance will have no legs to stand on. And this has been the discourse over the last 3 centuries. You name, in the last 3 centuries, any Muslim nation wanting to invade a Western nation invoking jihad. All of the jihad has been defensive in the last 3 centuries. But even that's been demonized. Even that's been stigmatized as well. So I think that should really pretty much put into perspective how brutal and oppressive the French actually were. I had a lot more written down here about the Qatar World Cup, and that really highlighted how pervasive liberalism has become. Because all of the ideas of one love and do what you want, and freedom of expression, freedom of choice, freedom of mobility, all of these ideas enshrined in the Human Rights Declaration, where do they draw their inspiration and influence from? From liberalism. But the thing is, liberalism is so incoherent, it will require an entire series of lectures to just deconstruct liberalism. But liberalism is so incoherent, it's subjected itself to hypocrisy. The whole liberal idea is based on hypocrisy. I'll just give you one example here. And this example should be enough to put everything into perspective. The slogan for the Qatar World Cup from liberal quarters was, "Love is love." So now, if love is used to justify and now legitimize homosexuality, then why can't love is love be used to legitimize polygamy? Why can't I have 4 wives? And using the same slogan, love is love. There's consent involved here, nobody's being harmed, nobody's being oppressed. Why doesn't it work there? Maybe on a more darker note, but I guess it's important to talk about, in LGBTQ, people have proposed to add LGBTQI, which is LGBTQ and then I stands for incest. Because LGBTQ, what is it? It's just a string of what's known as anti-normative sexual practices. Things which have gone against the norm, things which go against the tradition. So why don't you include incest in there? Using this harm principle, this is a liberal idea. You can use the harm principle to turn their own arguments on their head. So why don't we now champion and promote and advance the cause for incestuous feelings? Well, somebody might say, oh no, but that's wrong, and it's against the human spirit. It's against the human natural predisposition. So what about the L? What about the G? What about the B? What about the T? What about all of those ideas? Aren't they against the human spirit? You've justified L, G, B, T, and Q because of the harm principle. Let me do what I want to do as long as I'm not harming anybody else or harming society. So why don't you let then I'm even disgusted to say this, but why don't you even let a mother and a son, or a daughter and a father, or a brother and a sister engage in such filth? Based on the harm principle. They're not harming anybody. If they can use contraceptives, then what's the problem? So you will catch people out on this. You get 2 types of responses. You'll get somebody who'll say, you know what, we should add I and we should start campaigning for incest rights. The moment they say that, just turn around. There's no point even engaging with them. That's then indicative of how degenerate they've become. So there's no point even engaging with them. Then you get some people say, yeah, you know what, fair enough. Maybe the harm principle doesn't work here. So if the harm principle doesn't work here, then why would it work with the L and the G and the B and the T and the Q? So this is how flimsy and whimsical liberalism is. And very simply, another very important underpinning of liberalism is, we'll move on to our hero just with this last point. I feel as if it's important to mention, seeing as we're talking about liberalism, which is something called the utilitarian theory, which is the harm principle. Okay, do what you want as long as it doesn't harm and encroach on anybody else's rights. Well, the utilitarian theory is very simple, which is you should pursue, what do we class as good, what do we class as bad? Well, we need to have the maximum amount of pleasure for the maximum amount of people. You do what you want to do. If it makes you feel good, if it pleasures you, if you find enjoyment and satisfaction in it, then you do what you want to do. This utilitarian theory, coupled with the harm principle, brings about liberalism. And you know what? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has actually talked about this in the Quran. أَفَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَى. Allah says, have you not seen that person who takes his own desires and his own whims and his own fancies as his God, as his supreme deity? This John Stuart Mill that we were talking about earlier on, his father, James Mill, had a friend. They were all very prominent figures in the whole liberal sphere. Somebody called Jason Brantham. And he said very simply, every single human being, more specifically for myself, I have two gods. The God of pleasure and the God of evil. So I try to stay away from the God of evil and I try to appease and placate the God of pleasure. This is exactly what the Quran is talking about. And these are the ideas which underpin liberalism. Before we move on to our hero, there's a lot that we could say, but we'll just end on that. Before we move on to our hero here, which we'll hope to wrap up in 20 minutes, this is on the eve, 1930. This is what one of the Christian religious figures, the Cardinal of France, this is what he said on the anniversary, the 100th anniversary of French occupation in Algeria. He said, do not mistake the purpose of this celebration. It is not to commemorate 100 years of French presence in Algeria. The Romans spent 3 centuries in Algeria, but were eventually driven out. This is what he said. What we are celebrating is the funeral of Islam in this country. The era of the crescent in Algeria is over. So when they use their civilizational mission, then only those people who are true to their roots and true to their tradition will resist and reject. And if you look around the world today, the only people who are the true champions of tradition in any way are the Muslims. Unfortunately, the Christians have been bought over. The Christians have succumbed to social and societal pressure. There was one American Christian philosopher. He pretty much said, Christianity tried to change the world, but eventually Christianity let the world change it. And if you look today, just completely preposterous. The Pope of the Catholic order, nearly 56% of the world's Christians are Catholics. Now you have the Pope, the highest religious authority for the Catholics, for Catholicism, is saying gay marriage should be allowed. Homosexuality is completely fine. Whereas it's written in the Old Testament, which the Christians believe in, that is completely prohibited. The people of Gomorrah and the people of Sodom were punished for the crime of homosexuality. But when your traditions go out the window, when you feel ashamed of your own identity and your own heritage and your own background, then anything goes. When you tolerate everything, then you stand for nothing. Okay, let's end there on Algeria. This is a map of actually Iowa in America, and you've got a small town in the middle. Can anybody read that name? What does it say in the middle? It says Al-Qaeda. So this is a town in America, in Iowa, called Al-Qaeda. Now, I'm not going to introduce you to our hero just yet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to list all of his accolades. I'm going to list all of his international achievements. So hopefully that should pique your curiosity, because this man was an international celebrity. This is a town which is actually named after him. Just wrap your head around that. This is a town in America named after our hero. the spelling has been corrupted slightly, distorted, but he was an Algerian man. And this man headed the resistance against the French for 17 years. So why on earth, how on earth can somebody who promoted jihad, somebody who stood against the French liberal European order and colonialism, how did he manage to have a town inaugurated in his name in America, in a place today which champions liberalism, which champions this civilizational message? How did he manage that? The highest honor in America is the Congressional Medal of Honor, which is given to fallen soldiers. This man, our hero, was given that. He was given the Medal of Honor. He was commended in the European Parliament. In 1846 now, a newly founded American town. This one here, Al-Qaeda. And it's inhabited by Christians, by the way. Muslims don't live there. It's not as if it's a small, insulated community of Muslims. It was created by Catholics and Protestants. But for some reason, something compelled them to name their small town after a French anti-colonialist resistance fighter. For some reason. The American government was so overwhelmed by his magnanimity and his nobility for a few things that he did, we'll talk about that later on, that they sent him a horse as a prize, as a gift. And they sent him 2 pistols as a gift of honor as well, not just any old pistols, they were gold inlaid Colt pistols as well. So when people are given honors in America historically, then they were given a set of 2 Colt pistols. So an Algerian Muslim was given this. And he received personalized gifts from Abraham Lincoln himself, and medals and awards from nations and countries like Turkey. From France, he was given the Legion of Honor, the highest medal that could be given from the supreme leader of France. Greece, Great Britain, Russia, and the Pope himself. Imagine the Pope himself. So he displayed all of these bodies, all of these medals over a sash on his body. Not only that, he won public sentiment. So it's not as if it was just the government elites who were lauding and commending this man. He actually won public sentiment in France itself. And ironically, in France, you had an anonymous pamphlet was actually distributed. And it was entitled, I'm not going to say the name, I'm not going to spoil it, but the man's name, the Emperor of Arabia. So they suggested, some French citizens suggested, the Ottoman Empire is approaching its demise. So in its wake, why don't we create a new pan-Arab empire? An empire consisting of Syria and Arabia and Egypt and then Libya, Algeria, all of these Arabian empire, all of these Arabian nations clustered together to form an Arabian empire. And who better than to have this man as the emperor? So now, the question begs to be asked, why on earth, how on earth did the entire world show such eager reception to this man? What did he do? He must have done something. He was actually, this is just complete lunacy, but when the French elections were taking place, then his name was actually suggested as a potential candidate. Well, he didn't win, obviously, but I mean, how did an Arab find his way, a Muslim Arab find his way into the candidacy for French presidency? So he must have done something. This is now why we're introduced to our hero. This man's name is, and you should never forget this, his name was Amir Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi. That was his name. Amir because he was the leader. Abdul Qadir was his name, al-Jazairi. Al-Jazairi because he was from Algeria, Al-Jazair. So now, Al-Qadir, Abdul Qadir was his name. So the town was called Al-Qaeda. And people who come from the town today are known as Al-Qaedaites as well. So his legacy still lives on, not only in Algeria, but also in America. So he must have done something. Okay, so in 1830, the French arrived. And they came with 34,000 troops, and they were led under General de Michels was his name. And in 1831 now, they were approaching a very, very important, to the Algerians, a very strategically important port called Oran or Wahran. So news spread amongst the locals that the dreaded French army are approaching. So tribal leaders, because 90% of Algerian population was made up of tribal Bedouins and tribal nomads. Only even less than 10% inhabited the urban centers. So tribal leaders convened, and they created a consultative council. And their sole priority, it was a critical agenda for them, how do we deal with the French threat? So their first port of recourse was, we need to elect somebody as our Amir. We need to elect somebody as our leader who can lead us into the fray and charge this resistance effort and repel the French. An elderly man was amongst them. His name was Muhyiddin. And he was the father of Amir Abdul Qadir. And everybody unanimously appointed him. He was the most wise, he was the most skillful, he was the most devout, Islamically, out of all of them. He was appointed. But he really emphatically declined because of his old age. He said, how can I lead from the forefront? How can I lead? How can I lead the troops? How can I be a charismatic leader if I'm too old? And to be fair, they were all struck and completely bewildered by his refusal. And surprisingly, he turned and pointed at his young 24-year-old son. He nominated his young 24-year-old son, Amir Abdul Qadir. He wasn't known as Amir then. Abdul Qadir, just young Abdul Qadir. And he said, he will be your leader. He will be your Amir al-Mu'mineen. Not in the caliphal sense, but in the sense of a military leader. And to be fair, all I can say right now about Amir Abdul Qadir is, without revealing too much, is that this man's name really embellishes the golden pages of our Islamic history, and even world history, as you've seen, how he was adored and admired even in the West, for two reasons. Because he was one of those rare liberators of oppressed people, and he was a man who was committed to restoring justice and humanity in a time when madness prevailed across the world, much like Salahuddin. You can see many parallels between his story and Salahuddin's story as well. But he came from humble beginnings, just like any other prominent leader. He was born in 1807, and he came from a very scholarly and pious family in a small village in the desert in Algeria, known as Guatna. That was the name of the village. And that time in Algeria, you had two different political groups. You had two different political groups when it came to the tribal people. You had the Makhzan tribe, the Makhzan elite, and then you had the Raya. So the Makhzans were the warrior class. They were skilled and they served the Ottomans. They collected taxes and they kept the peace as well. And then the Raya, they were the settled and more peaceful ones. But they were dominated by, the Makhzan tribes as well. So from within the Raya themselves, you had the subgroup which Amir Abdul Qadir came from. They were known as the Marabut, or the Marabouts in English. And they were known for their exceptional piety and their devoutness and their wisdom. These people were well educated and they were religious as well. So Amir Abdul Qadir, his mother was a big inspiration for him. And this just proves that if you want to create leaders, if you want to create people who are revolutionaries, people who can change the world, people who want to change the world, then it all starts from the home environment. And it all starts from the lap of the mother. His mum was a huge inspiration and influence for him, and really then encouraged him and motivated him to change the world as he did. So she was his greatest benefactor. So she taught him how to read and write, how to even mend his own shoes, how to perform ablution and wudu, and even taught him hadith as well. So when he was now elected, he was actually nominated by his father. Now the thing is, he was only 24 years old. His father was way into his 80s. All the other tribal leaders were advanced in their age as well. So an air of distrust and resentment started to form amongst the other tribal leaders. Now why did Muhyiddin nominate one of us? Why would he nominate a child, an inexperienced child, an inexperienced, inept youth? So Amir Abdul Qadir faced a lot of problems during his early ages from his own circles. But he needed to prove himself, and proved himself he indeed did. He mounted stiff resistance against the French for not 1 but 2, 13, for 17 years. He managed to unify all of the tribes. And remember, this is a reoccurring theme across Islamic history. When an outside aggressor makes inroads into Muslim lands, then the Muslim hero and liberator of the time always begins with unifying the Muslims. Salahuddin had to do that. Amir Abdul Qadir had to do that as well. Because it's very simple. How can Muslims defend themselves against outside oppression and aggression if they themselves are scattered? If they themselves don't have unified ranks if they themselves are on different wavelengths. And how do we do that? I'll give you a practical tip on how to do that. Not from me, but from the Prophet ﷺ. He turned around, the Prophet ﷺ was leading prayer, or just about to start the prayer. He turned around and looked at his congregant, looked at the companions, and he saw somebody just out of line when they were making their rows. So he pushed him back, and he said very sternly, لَتُسَوُّنَّ صُفُوفَكُمْ أَوْ لَيُخَالِفَنَّ اللَّهُ بَيْنَ قُلُوبِكُمْ. You should straighten your rows, you should stand shoulder to shoulder, you should make sure your rows stood straight in line with each other. Otherwise, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will spread discord and enmity and disunity amongst your hearts. So it all starts from the mosque. If you're stood slightly out of line with somebody else, then that's an opportunity for disunity to arise amongst our hearts. Now, what do you think about somebody who's praying salah in the house? What do you think about somebody who's not even coming to the mosque? If this is the situation for people who are stood just slightly out of line inside the mosque, at least they're here for salah, what do you think about people who aren't even praying inside the mosque? What do you think about the unity or the disunity affecting the Muslims because we're not coming to the mosque? So it all starts from the mosque. It all starts from the masjid, this air of unity and solidarity. So he started to unify the tribes, and he used the carrot and the stick method. Now, with tribal villages, it's very difficult. They're unruly, they're undisciplined, so he had to cultivate these sophisticated, civilized traits within them through Islam, through good Islamic instruction, through the Quran and through the Hadith. And he managed to do that. He managed to create his own mini-state, his own, in a way, his own mini-empire inside of Algeria, simultaneously whilst the French were making inroads and advancing on his own people. So he organized the army, and he had this really impressive floating city called the Sabella, where it was constantly on the move. Imagine a city, it was pretty much nearly half the size of Preston. His city was half the size of Preston, constantly on the move. It could just get up, pack up, and move and relocate somewhere else. It had all the local amenities that a city would have. It had stores, it had shops, it had educational facilities, it had mosques, everything, which could just be packed up and moved, all based on tents as well. So he built a state out of these Bedouins. That's why he's seen as a great leader and a great strategist. The French, they sent general after general, but to no avail. So they decided to make a mutually beneficial treaty in 1834. We can't fight you, so we're going to pause hostilities, so at least we can focus on our civilizational message and mission, and you can carry on with your own state building as well. And this peace treaty was hailed by a success. It was hailed as a success by everyone. But the thing is, the French were quite treacherous and duplicitous. So what they did was they left a few terms of the treaty vague so that they could be manipulated and exploited later on for their own personal national ambitions as well. And when they did that, hostilities resumed. This is when they thought, you know what, we need to make things cemented. We need to consolidate the peace between the French and the Algerians. And this was then embodied in 1837, the Treaty of Tafna. And this only served to empower Amir Abdul Qadir even more. And he was given respite from the French. He could accrue more land. And he focused on building his own power base now with the cover of the ceasefire. And this man, he was motivated by the Prophet ﷺ. He was motivated by an idea to rebuild the city of Al-Madinah on a wider scale in his own now territory in Algeria. And he wanted to develop his capital city. Taqadmat was the name of his city. And he wanted to fashion it along the lines of the Prophet's city, Medina, based on justice and based on peaceful coexistence and based on the laws of the Prophet and his God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he was so moved by the Prophet's message that he even coined the official coinage and currency of his new state was actually called the Al-Muhammadiyya, in commemoration of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And when people said, take this title of Sultan, take it for yourself, he refused. This just shows his humility and his simplicity, how down to earth he was. He gave all of the high posts and high positions to scholars, and he was if there's one thing which you can describe Amir Abdul Qadir with, is his uncompromising integrity. No matter the situation, no matter who he was faced with, no matter the challenges he confronted, he always stuck true to his tradition and to his Islamic teachings. This is why, and I mean, this just goes to show, like Umar radiallahu anhu always used to say, we were people who were given honor by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the moment we move away from Allah, that's when Allah now debases us. That's when Allah now brings shame and humiliation upon us. So he now started his state-building ambitions after this treaty of Tafna. And he employed these professional Christians and Jews as well, just like you can see the parallels with Salahuddin. Even before the Geneva Conventions, even before they had written up a manual on how to treat prisoners, Amir Abdul Qadir had already authored and instituted his own guidelines on how to humanely and compassionately treat not just any old prisoners, we're talking about French prisoners of war here. These are aggressors who made their way into his own homeland. And he gave them rights way before human rights were even a thing, way before the Human Rights Declaration in 1947. And he even allowed French prisoners of war to lodge complaints against any malpractice or any misappropriation of justice which could have been carried out against them. And he treated them with extreme hospitality, and he even freed, I mean, these are the acts of nobility and compassion which he carried out. He even freed some French prisoners of war because he didn't have any food left to feed them with. So he set them free. Much like the early caliphs, he was very down to earth and he was a humble man. And at the height of his conquest, at the height of his rule, when other rulers would have been satisfying themselves and indulging themselves in entertainment and vanity projects and debauchery, living in palaces and castles, he satisfied and contented himself with living in a tent. Throughout his 17 years, he lived out of a tent. He used to say to the French, even if you filled my hooded cloak with jewels and all the treasures of the world, I would cast them into the sea without hesitation. He had everything at his doorstep, yet the only thing that mattered to him was his Islamic ideals. And this is very important because this man was everything the Prophet ﷺ stood for. He was a true embodiment of the Sunnah in whatever he did. He excelled in it and he infused, this is the thing, in whatever he did, he infused an Islamic outlook and an Islamic spirit into it. He was a scholar, he was a noble leader, he was a warrior, he was a businessman as well, he was a saint, he was a Sufi saint of the Qadiri order, he was a diplomat, and above all, he was an ardent admirer and lover of the Prophet ﷺ. And this is what spurred on his whole mission. Things took a turn for the worse in 1841. This is where the liberation war now becomes gruesome and takes a decisive turn. Unfortunately, not for Amir Abdul Qadir, but for the French. This is where the nefarious and malevolent evil man that we talked about before, General Bugeaud, is now sent into France. And he is given open permission. Remember, the ends justify the means. You carry out whatever you want to do. These razzias, these rapid raids and incursions into villages, targeting innocent civilians and non-combatants. And he said, General Bugeaud sent a letter to Amir Abdul Qadir, and he said, I will enter your mountains, I will burn your villages and your harvests, and I will cut down your fruit trees. So for the next few years, you had wins for both sides, you had victories, both suffered defeats as well, but ultimately it was French brutality which prevailed. Why? Because the French had a total disregard for human sanctity and a total disregard for human nobility. And that's what ultimately led to the defeat of Amir Abdul Qadir. Everything he fought for, the resistance he orchestrated and led, he led it personally from the front. He didn't sit in his command center and direct operations. He led from the front like a true charismatic leader should do. Everything he fought for, everything he knew, eventually, incrementally, was seized or captured or vanquished. He used to seek refuge in neighboring Morocco. But in 1844, the French put so much pressure on the Moroccan Sultan that he was forced to now class Amir Abdul Qadir as an outlaw. So he had nowhere to go. His Sabella, his massive floating city, was destroyed by the French prince as well. So he was left to wander the deserts. He was with his group of loyal followers. They were malnourished and they were exhausted. Eventually, they decided to surrender. Because sometimes the best course of option is to know when you've lost. But the thing is, he didn't give up the resistance effort. He just planted the seeds. And this is what's very important. If you want to strike and cause a revolution, change won't happen in a day. Change won't happen even in 1 year. There's so much groundwork to cover. People are always talking and harping on about the liberation efforts in Palestine and in Kashmir and in Syria and in India as well. But things don't happen overnight. Amir Abdul Qadir only led the effort for 17 years. And when did the Algerians ultimately ended up receiving their independence? In 1962. So that's nearly 120 years down the line. But the reward for those 120 years of struggle, like Sadaqah Jariyah, continuous, perpetual charity, he didn't give any money for it, he gave his life. He sacrificed his own health and his own resources and his own livelihood for the French resistance venture. And this is also a form of Sadaqah Jariyah. But remember, it took nearly 120 years. Change doesn't come overnight. And it always reminds me of a quote of Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, which is, when I was young, I wanted to change the world. But as I grew older and wiser, I realized I need to change the world first before I can change the world. The best time for change is when you're in the mosque, when you're talking to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when you're conversing with Him in salah, because that's a communion between you and your God, between you and Allah. Change, the best time for change can only come when you've built a connection and rapport with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through salah. Salah is the most important, effective, transformative tool that any Muslim has. Why? Because Allah says very simply, and Amir Abdul Qadir, he also emphasizes this idea as well. This is his idea, this is his concept of a reciprocal relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Somebody asked him, he was at one of these transit stations, and somebody asked him, why are the Christians taking over? Why are the Muslims being humiliated like we see today? He said, very simply, because we've abandoned our religion. And because we've abandoned our religion, Allah will put over us, in charge over us, in command over us, people who will humiliate us. Because we've humiliated the religion, Allah will now humiliate us. And he said, we have a reciprocal relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah does things for us, we do things for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he echoed a verse of the Quran, In tansurullah yansurkum wa yuthabbit aqdamakum. Very simple, which is, if you help Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah will help you, and He will firmly embed your feet into the ground. He'll give you stability, and He'll give you clarity of vision, and this collective planning and conscience which the Muslims are so desperately seeking for in today's world. He said, Allah is your nasir, Allah is your helper, but Allah will only manifest Himself to you as a nasir if you are Allah's nasir. If you help Allah, He will help you. But if you're a khadil for Allah, if you're somebody who forsakes Allah, somebody who abandons Allah, Allah will manifest Himself to you as a khadil, as an abandoner, as somebody who forsakes you. Because remember, as the Prophet ﷺ said, he said, quoting Allah Himself, أَنَا عِنْدَ ظَنِّ عَبْدِي بِي, I will act with my servants how they hold their perceptions about me. However you think of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be, Allah will act like that to you. However you act towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah will act in the exact same way to you. That's what you call justice. And in many cases, Allah will act with compassion and mercy. But we have to attract that mercy. That mercy is there floating everywhere in the earth, everywhere in space, everywhere around us. We have to tap into these radio waves of mercy, just like you have to tune your radio to receive the frequencies of radio waves. You have to tune yourselves in to pick up the frequency of Allah's mercy. And the best way to do that is through the mosque. And the thing is, everything comes back to the mosque. Because when Allah descends His mercies on a community, He starts with the mosque. So the people of the mosque, the inhabitants of the mosque, receive them firsthand by the angels themselves. So these are the ideas that Amir Abdul Qadir espoused. And Amir Abdul Qadir then promoted and motivated his troops with. And eventually he surrendered to the French. His liberation ended, his efforts for liberation ended in 1847. He handed in his war horse, and he made only one request. His one request was to the French his French captors, let me live in a distant Muslim land, let me live out the rest of my days with peace and worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he then suggested, let me go to Alexandria, which is a port town in Egypt. And in a final act of treachery, as if the French hadn't showed enough of that, the French reneged on their promise. They said, yes, you can surrender, we'll honor all of your agreements and the promises that we've made here today. the French imprisoned him. He turned himself in, the French imprisoned him and his family and his loyal followers. And instead of shipping him off to Alexandria, they transferred him to a French prison in Toulouse, in the south of France, modern-day France. And for the next 5 years, he had to then endure this ordeal for the next 5 years, where him and his entourage now began a series of agonizing transfers from one prison cell to another prison, and they had to endure adverse and unpleasant conditions. And this is how they lived, in fear, not knowing what would happen to them tomorrow, for 5 years. But the thing is, his reputation had already preceded him. His reputation as a man of honor and a man of unflinching dignity. And I mean, even when he had captured so many French soldiers, they went back when they were eventually released, and they told stories of how humane and how merciful, how compassionate, how noble Amir Abdul Qadir actually was. So his story actually spread to France even before he reached France. And to the surprise of his captors, when he started to move from prison to prison, then French citizens, local French citizens, would greet him with a parade and would greet him with a procession, honoring this noble man who's now set foot in their town. And the thing is, Amir Abdul Qadir, his idea and his embodiment of this unflinching dignity as a man of honor became proverbial in France. And he became a tourist destination in and of himself. He became like a national celebrity. So people wanted to see who this very magnanimous but cool, calm and collected resistance fighter against the French were, who this man actually was. So people traveled from Paris all the way to the south of France to meet this man. And they wanted his autograph, they wanted to meet him, they wanted portraits to be taken with him. So he became now a national celebrity. When he was in Marseille, then, subhanAllah, all of his French guards became a Muslim. Just by his conduct, all of his French guards became a Muslim, his French captors. And if you go to Marseille today, there's actually a graveyard specially made for these French guards who became Muslims. Just one, it looks out of place, a graveyard just with a few Muslim graves. And they house the bodies of these French guards who were converted to Islam at the hands of Amir Abdul Qadir. And the thing is, for him, his actions spoke louder than his words. He didn't have to sit there and deliver lectures and seminars to proselytize people. He didn't have to sit there for an endless amount of hours convincing people of the truth of Islam. His actions, his conduct, his demeanor exuded a sense of nobility, exuded a sense of Islamic appeal. That's why people loved him. That's why people adored him. That's why people admired him. So he went from prison to prison until he ended up in Paris itself. And the funny thing is, the French people, the same French people who were petitioning for the civilizational message and colonization to take place around the world, were now petitioning for Amir Abdul Qadir to be released. And the pressure was too heavy for the French Emperor Napoleon III to bear, so he ended up freeing Amir Abdul Qadir and showering him with gifts and state apologies, and he was now free. He was set loose and to do what he wanted. Now this was when Amir Abdul Qadir thought, I could have a life of a peaceful retirement. So he made his way to Turkey, then from Turkey he made his way to Damascus. And he thought, now is the time for a quiet end to my life. So he started teaching in the Grand Mosque of Damascus. He had his own complex with his Algerian expatriates as well. He also brought his very influential and inspirational mother with him. So he settled down in Damascus. So now you might think, right, we're closing the chapter, the closing the book of Amir Abdul Qadir. This is when the main chapter of his life now opens. In 1860, he is in Damascus. And tensions start to boil in Damascus between the Christians and the Muslims, because the Christians have now been emboldened because of rights that have been given to them by external Christian powers. External Christian powers like the Russians and the French and the British were meddling in Ottoman internal affairs. So this only emboldened and empowered the Christian subjects to defy state rules. So they withheld taxes and they were arrogant. They arrogantly and pompously then flaunted themselves on the streets and they flouted government rules. Muslims became annoyed, and now this reached a boiling point in Damascus whilst Amir Abdul Qadir was still there. In 1860, in March, the riots of Damascus erupted, where a group of Muslims, some Muslims, but mostly Druze, they were an offshoot of Islam, and they ended up leaving Islam, a sect. You could say they even apostatized from Islam, but they were still associated with Islam, the Druze and some Muslims. They went around the streets of the old city, the Christian quarters of Damascus, with their pitchforks and with their weapons and with their rifles, and they started indiscriminately targeting Christians. And now by this time, the entirety of Damascus had been engulfed by mayhem and terror and rioting, and the Christians were being oppressed even in their own homes. This is when Amir Abdul Qadir, now with his band of 40 Algerians, they galloped around the streets of the old city in Damascus, protecting the Christians and sheltering them in his own complex. And throughout the days which turned into weeks, Christian observers in his own complex said that we just saw men, women and children from all over the world, Christians being brought into, given safety and refuge in his shelter. And they numbered into the thousands. There are some exaggerated reports. Some reports say 14,000 were housed in his own complex. Some say 3,000 to 4,000, which sounds more reasonable. So he actually went out and ventured into the streets, rounding up these Christian victims of the riots. The Christian quarter was burnt to the ground. It was burnt to a cinder. You had angry mobs running around everywhere. Now the angry mobs learned that Amir Abdul Qadir was giving shelter and refuge to the Christians. So they turned up at his door. They were pounding on his door. They were pressuring him to release the Christians. And they said that these are the enemies of Islam. They were trying to appeal to him. These were the enemies of Islam. And they said to Amir Abdul Qadir, these Christians were the same enemies you were fighting in Algeria. These are the same French colonizers you had so boldly resisted in Algeria. And he said to the bloodthirsty crowd, he made his way outside. And he said, these Christians are my guest. Try to take any one of them away from me, and you will learn just how well my soldiers fight. And he said, this is the key point here. He said, today we will fight for a just cause, just as we fought for a just cause in Algeria. So his whole idea was that just as we fought a jihad in Algeria, we're also fighting a jihad today, which is a religious struggle to protect the rights of people, to protect the religion. And our religion has accorded and afforded these Christians rights living in Muslim lands. So who are we to then encroach upon their own rights and their own dignity and their own nobility? And for the weeks to come, he went out with his group and band of cavaliers. They went around the streets searching for more and more Christians to house inside his complex. And as he passed by these hostile hordes, he kept on telling them, this is not the Prophet's way. This is not what the Prophet ﷺ would have condoned. This is not the behavior the Prophet would have endorsed. You're dishonoring the Prophet through your actions here. And he told his followers that protecting these Christians was as much as a jihad and a religious struggle as what we did in Algeria. This was why he became such a global international celebrity. Now the thing is, the French consul was actually amongst the people that he saved, was actually amongst the victims that he saved. When the tensions died down, then he was completely amazed by the courage and kindness of Amir Abdul Qadir. So he wrote in a French newspaper, which was released the following year. And I quote, he wrote, "We were in consternation during the riots, all of us quite convinced that our last hour had arrived. In that expectation of death, in those indescribable moments of anguish, heaven appeared to us. This heaven was our savior, sent to us by God. Amir Abdul Qadir had appeared, surrounded by his Algerians, around 40 of them. He was on horseback and without arms. His handsome figure, calm and imposing, made a strange contrast with the noise and disorder that reigned everywhere. All of those achievements that we listed at the start were all because of this. All because of this one moment of civility and humanity he displayed to his fellow human beings." And he later on went on to say that what we did for the Christians, we did not because we wanted to win favor and win points with the Europeans, but because we wanted to remain faithful to our Islamic law and out of respect of human rights, which our religion, Islam, has afforded to different people. And he said, my motives amounted to a sacred duty. I was simply an instrument of Allah. And this is the cherry on the cake here. The New York Times, out of all media outlets, reported with this. They said, it is no light thing for history to record that the most uncompromising soldier of Muslim independence, meaning Amir Abdul Qadir, let's not forget, for 17 years against the French colonialist powers in Algeria, they said, the most uncompromising soldier of Muslim independence became now the most intrepid and the most fearless guardian of Christian lives. He ended up passing away around 20 years after that. He lived a peaceful life in 1883. But his legacy remains vivid up until today. For two reasons. We're going to sum up with two reasons. I'm going to conclude here. Number one is, he was fearless in the face of adversity. For 17 years, he continued jihad against the French. For 17 years, he gave up all comforts. He lived in a tent for 17 years. And he witnessed firsthand the sacrifices which needed to be made so that the cause of Islam could be furthered, so that Islam could reign supreme over the world. And let's not confuse ourselves here with this very important idea, which is, okay, the West see themselves as enlightened and in need of spreading their ideas of civilization or progress. So what about us Muslims? We see ourselves from a religious, ethical point of view as superior because we have the Quran, we have the Hadith. How much more superiority could we have? And we feel as if we should spread this idea to the rest of the world. But we do that through peaceful means. We do that through our actions. We do that through our demeanor and character, just like the companions. The companions had to resort to warfare, but for the companions, their go-to means of spreading and propagating the religion of Islam was through their actions and through their conduct with people from all walks of life. This is what Amir Abdul Qadir managed to accomplish. He managed to win over the hearts of all Europeans and Americans. I mean, he even had a town named after him, Al-Qaeda, and the inhabitants are Al-Qaedarites. Why? Because he was true to his identity and his heritage as a Muslim. And number two is, this is very important. Every single one of us here is responsible for spreading the beautiful teachings of Islam. And how do we do that? Through our actions. Just like Amir Abdul Qadir. Now, he fought the Europeans for 17 years. You would expect him to be full of rage and to be full of vengeance and resentment, and that he'd just stand by the sidelines and do nothing whilst the Europeans and the Christians in Damascus were being oppressed and were being looted. But he didn't, because of his religion of Islam. So what we have to understand here is, and what I want you to take back, is every single non-Muslim that you see, every single non-Muslim colleague that you might have, every single non-Muslim friend that you might have in your friend circle, any non-Muslim you meet on the street, even a non-Muslim clerk or cashier, remember, you are an ambassador of Islam. And their perception of Islam will be based on how you portray the religion, because your actions speak louder than their words, than your words. That's why the Prophet ﷺ said to Ali radiallahu anh, لَأَنْ يَهْدِيَ اللَّهُ بِكَ رَجُلًا وَاحِدًا خَيْرٌ لَكَ مِنْ حُمُرِ النَّعَمِ. If one person can be guided to the straight path through you, then it's better than anything that anybody can ever imagine to have. It's better than the entire world and what it contains. And this could be a means of perpetual charity for yourself. As-sadaqatun jariyah. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, number one, that He forgives all of our sins. Number two, He empowers us with education of our history. And number three, He allows us to then imitate and emulate people like Amir Abdul Qadir. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.